You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 393, the Yazoo Land Scandal. Near the end of 1794, the Georgia legislature passed a law that sold most of the state's western lands to a few private companies. These lands were called the Yazoo lands since the Yazoo River flowed through some of them. These lands made up much of what is today Alabama and Mississippi. The law, which was finalized in 1795, led to charges of corruption and scandal. It generated lawsuits that lasted for decades, eventually resulting in a landmark Supreme Court decision. Like most land disputes in North America, we find the origins of the problems coming from London's Privy Council, which set Georgia's boundaries when the colony first received its charter in 1732. It put no western border on the colony, other than perhaps the Pacific Ocean. The reason for this was that Britain hoped that all of its colonies would push westward, claiming lands in the interior of North America in order to challenge the competing claims of other European colonial powers. When the 1783 Treaty of Paris established the Mississippi River as the western border of the United States, Georgia claimed all of the lands to the west of its colony as far west as that river. Of course, the Native Americans who lived on the land also claimed it as their own. Spain also had claims to parts of this land until the 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo that we covered last week. South Carolina also claimed a portion of these lands. We've seen conflicting land claims like these lead to lawsuits, government petitions, and even all-out war to settle the claims. The Yazoo lands were no different. Those who wanted to get rich by speculating on western lands were rarely afraid of the legal or even physical battles that they would have to fight in order to claim this land as their own. Such risks often paid off when they could settle those claims and then sell the land at a huge profit to settlers. One of the first big land deals attempted came right at the end of the Revolutionary War when William Blount and John Sevier formed a company to settle the Muscle Shoals region along the Tennessee River in what is today northern Alabama. Sevier had moved to this region before the Revolution and had been actively fighting with the Cherokee for control of the territory. He was the man who, during the Revolutionary War, had led the Over-Mountain Men to the Battle of Kings Mountain, and he would later go on to become governor of the purported state of Franklin. Blount was a North Carolina official who hoped to get rich on western lands. He had served as a paymaster during the war, at least until he managed to lose $300,000 after the Battle of Camden. After that, he served in both the North Carolina legislature and the Continental Congress. Around the same time that Blount and Sevier were trying to get western land rights from the Georgia legislature, Blount was also pushing North Carolina's Land Grab Act that attempted to open western lands to settlement in that region. As it turned out, the Georgia legislature would not go along at this time, but of course the land speculators would be back. In 1788, after Georgia ratified the Constitution, it tried to cede a large portion of its western lands to the federal government. The land offered, however, was too remote for any other settlements. It was in the middle of lands claimed by the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw tribes. Part of the land was also still claimed by Spain, so Congress refused to accept the land grant at that time. Georgia was still relatively unpopulated with white settlers at this time. There were still vast swaths of land, even in the eastern part of the state, that were completely undeveloped. Georgia law permitted the government to provide grants to new settlers who would help develop the land. The goal was to populate the state. Laws required cultivation of the land for at least a year before title was given, and limits of no more than 1,000 acres per individual. All of the Georgia governors ignored these rules, giving away land grants to well-connected speculators and others who often obtained tens of thousands of acres, sometimes more than 1 million acres. Many of these land grants also didn't even cover actual land. Fraudulent surveys created fraudulent land claims. In 1796, the state's 24 organized counties contained a total of 8.7 million acres. At the same time, those counties had land grants on file for over 29 million acres. Land dealers sold these grants to gullible buyers in northern states and from Europe, people who would never be able to find their claims if they ever came to the state. Since it was out-of-state speculators who were being cheated, no one seemed to care much as the investment money flowed into the state and often greased the palms of government officials at all levels. This was the environment that existed when Georgia tried to open up its western lands for sale in 1789. At that point, 3 large investment companies agreed to purchase about 25 million acres of western lands. The companies included some really wealthy and powerful men. The head of the South Carolina Yazoo Company was Alexander Moultrie, who was also at the time the state's attorney general. Another major investor was Isaac Hugie, who of course had been a continental general and was currently serving as South Carolina's federal marshal. The South Carolina Yazoo Company purchased about 10 million acres, much of it along the Mississippi River, and included what is today Vicksburg. Total cost was around $67,000. Another company, the Tennessee Yazoo Company, was headed by Zachariah Cox, who had taken a position as assistant clerk of the Georgia House, giving him an influential position with the legislature. His company, backed by others, including William Blount and John Sevier, once again tried to purchase the Muscle Shoals area along the Tennessee border, nearly 4 million acres, for about $47,000. A third company, the Virginia Yazoo Company, which included former Governor Patrick Henry, also tried to get in on the action. This company bought somewhere between 7 and 11 million acres for $94,000. The exact size of the purchase is vague because all of the land was still under the control of the Chickasaw Nation, and it was unclear how much of that land could eventually be made available for settlement. So for only around a total of about $200,000, these 3 companies bought most of Georgia's western lands. Almost immediately, the deals caused a public backlash. The land sale resulted in the land being sold for just over 1 cent per acre, a ridiculously small amount. The new federal government also raised concerns. Georgia was relying on questionable treaties that it had made with the tribes that controlled the land. Many tribal leaders denied that those who signed those treaties had any authority to do so, and President Washington, not wanting to see another major Indian war in the South, issued a proclamation in the summer of 1790 warning that only the federal government had authority to make treaties with the Indians, and that settlers who tried to move onto Indian lands not authorized by federal treaties were not under the government's protection. One group of settlers who had moved into the Muscle Shoals area were forcibly removed by the Cherokee, who still claimed ownership of this land, and after the settlers' removal, the Cherokee burned all of the buildings so that they could not be reoccupied. The Georgia politicians who had approved this land deal quickly realized that without the public support and without federal support, this whole thing was going to fall apart. If they could not convey the land, the companies might want their money back. And of course, one important principle of all land deals at this time seemed to be no refunds. The companies had been given 2 years to come up with the purchase money. The terms of the sale had not specified how the payments would be made. The buyers expected to pay in depreciated state or continental paper, which was probably worth about 1/8 of its nominal value. Before they could make those payments, about 6 months after the deal was finalized, Georgia passed a law requiring that all payments be made in specie, that is, gold or silver. There was no way the companies could come up with that much real money. When they offered payment with paper currency, the treasurer refused to accept it per state law. When the payment deadline passed at the end of 1791, the treasurer stated that payment had not been provided, and the state foreclosed on the grants, retook possession of the land, and kept any money that had already been paid. Now, one of the companies that lost its purchase money tried to bring a case before the U.S. Supreme Court, but after ratification of the 11th Amendment, that case was dismissed. Despite getting ripped off by the Georgia legislature, the speculators and investors retreated and regrouped to try again. Some new players also joined the competition. In 1794, they made another attempt to buy up Georgia's western lands. This time, the largest group was being run by local Georgians. The Georgia group was run by James Gunn, who was at the time one of the 2 U.S. senators from Georgia. Gunn was originally a Virginian who had served in the Continental Army during the war. After the war, he settled in Savannah, where he began a law practice and established a plantation. Gunn was always on one financial hustle after another, and also had a history of being quite combative. One example of this comes from the war, which sheds some light on his character. During his military service in Georgia, his government-issued horse was killed in battle. By tradition, officers who lost a horse were allowed to pick another one from any that were available. Gunn managed to get an extremely valuable horse as his replacement. He then traded the horse to a local plantation owner for 2 other horses and a slave. His commander at the time, General Nathaniel Greene, felt that trading away government property for other property was a violation of military rules. This resulted in an official inquiry into Gunn's actions. The court-martial acquitted Gunn of any criminal wrongdoing, but the Continental Congress condemned his actions. Gunn believed that Greene was responsible for this attack on his honor and challenged General Greene to a duel. Greene declined the duel after discussing the matter with both General Anthony Wayne and General George Washington, who both told him that commanding officers should never fight a duel with subordinates over their official decisions. Gunn continued to consider Greene to be an enemy and regularly threatened to kill him. Even after the war ended, Greene carried a sidearm to defend himself if Gunn ever tried to make good on his threats. This dispute only ended after Greene died of sunstroke. Gunn also quickly made political enemies with James Jackson, who won a seat in the House of Representatives, as well as Anthony Wayne, who Gunn defeated in a competition for one of Georgia's first Senate seats. In the Senate, Gunn associated himself with the Federalists and supported most of Hamilton's policies. He also started the tradition of senatorial courtesy. That is the tradition where one senator can hold up any nomination to any federal appointment if that appointment is to his home state. Gunn objected to Washington's appointment of Benjamin Fishburne for a position in the Customs Service for the Port of Savannah. Fishburne was a political ally of Anthony Wayne and had also taken Greene's side in the wartime dispute over the horse trade. Gunn didn't articulate any specific reason for his objection when Washington inquired, and Washington ended up moving on and nominating someone else. Gunn should have been in Philadelphia in late 1794 to attend a session of the U.S. Senate. Instead, he stayed in Augusta to lobby for the land sale that his company wanted. He coordinated his efforts with 3 other companies that also wanted to buy land. This included the Georgia-Mississippi Company, the Tennessee Company, and the Upper Mississippi Company. Gunn coordinated with these 3 other groups so that they would not end up creating conflicting purchases of the land and would not end up competing with one another, thus raising the price of the land. The combined proposal of the 4 companies was for about 35 million acres of western land, about 10 million more than the 1789 proposal. The total payment for this land would be about $250,000, which was more than the $200,000 offered in 1788, but since it also included an additional 10 million acres, the cost per acre was even less than before. Much of the new land added to this deal was the areas that were claimed by Spain. Speculators believed that these disputed claims would soon be settled by what became the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and that this treaty would give the U.S. control of these lands. The speculators, not to get caught again, specified in the agreement that the purchase could be made with paper money and would not be required to be paid in specie. Given that this paper could be purchased at about 1/8 of the same value in specie, the buyers were actually getting all this land for something closer to around $30,000 in gold or silver. Now you might be asking, why would Georgia try to settle this land again for a pittance after there was so much public opposition to the last attempted sale? Well, one big reason was that the state was broke. Georgia had been spending money defending its frontier against the Creek Nation, and it didn't want to raise taxes. There was also a clock ticking on the sale. If they sold the rights to the land before the U.S. and Spain settled their conflicting claims, and Spain retained control of those lands, then that would be the buyer's problem. If the U.S. acquired the disputed land, the federal government might claim the land for itself and cut Georgia out of any land sales there. For the buyers, getting the disputed land now meant it was much cheaper thanks to the risk of the title, and if the federal government succeeded in claiming the land, it would respect the private owner's purchases. Now, perhaps the biggest reason, though, that the legislature pushed through the bill was corruption. Senator Gunn simply paid bribes to a majority of the legislature. With enough palms appropriately greased, the legislature approved the sale. However, no one considered paying off the governor. Matthews vetoed the sale. On December 29, 1794, Matthews' veto statement said that the amount of money offered for the land was inadequate, that too little land was reserved for Georgia citizens to purchase, that putting all these western lands in the hands of a few companies would slow settlement of a state which was growing based on giving away land to new settlers, and because there was no public notice of the sale to accept rival offers who might have increased the price of these sales. Following the veto, the buyers and legislators scrambled to get the governor on board. The buyers agreed to double their price to $500,000. The legislature tied the bill to an act that would pay bounties for soldiers who had fought in battles with the Creek Nation. So if the governor refused to let this deal go through, he would be subject to attack for not supporting the troops. A little over a week later, on January 7, 1795, Matthews signed the amended bill into law. Once again, the legislature had sold the bulk of the land to a few wealthy insiders for a mere pittance. Senator James Jackson, who was a political opponent of Senator Gunn, resigned his seat in the U.S. Senate so that he could return to Georgia and devote himself full-time to overturning this corrupt deal. He led a campaign to throw out of office every legislator who voted for the deal. The voters went along and cleaned house, electing reformers, including Senator Jackson, to the next Georgia State House. Governor Matthews also lost his bid for re-election. The incoming leaders formed a committee, led by Jackson, to investigate the deal and the corruption. As it turned out, all but one of the legislators who voted for the sale had received a bribe. Some of those bribes came in the form of shares in the companies, which would be worth thousands of dollars once the land deal was completed. Other legislators demanded cash up front. Most demanded a standard payment of $1,000. One state rep, Thomas Rayburn, settled for a mere $600. After the scandal broke, he got teased for selling out for so little. His reply was that it only showed that he wasn't that greedy. Others received slaves or titles to eastern lands in exchange for their votes. A few members who could not be persuaded to vote for the deal because they believed it would end their political careers if they voted for the deal accepted payoffs to leave town and just miss the vote entirely. The investigation also determined that there were other groups willing to buy the land for a much higher price, but since the legislators had taken bribes from the lower bidders, they ignored these higher offers and went with those who had already bought their votes. In light of the corruption, the Reform Legislature passed the Rescinding Act of 1796. This act declared the land sales null and void. It took back title to all lands sold as being fraudulently obtained. It ordered all records related to the sale to be destroyed and instructed the law itself to be burned. Further, it made a crime for any state official to record any land record related to this deal. 2 days after the act's passage, on February 15, 1796, the legislature gathered for a ritual burning of the law. As the governor and the legislature watched, the statute and all the records related to the sale were put in a big pile. They then used a magnifying glass to light it on fire, with this symbolizing that it was being consumed by fire from heaven. The Rescinding Act resulted in a much larger national debate. Alexander Hamilton, who was by this time a private attorney, drafted a legal opinion on behalf of New England investors who had benefited from the Yazoo land deal. He argued that the Rescinding Act was unconstitutional and legally void. Hamilton pointed out that the Constitution explicitly denied states the power to impair contracts. Voiding a completed contract exceeded the state's legal authority. He argued that innocent third parties had already bought land from the companies. These innocent buyers had relied on a legally binding contract. The dispute became another division between Federalists, who agreed with Hamilton's position, and the Democratic Republicans, who argued that a contract based on corruption and bribery is inherently illegal and could not be enforced. The ongoing legal disputes would last for decades. Next week, Tennessee becomes the 16th state to join the Union. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show on the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp, and to Robert Morris Circle supporter Curtis Johnson. I also want to thank David Bennett for a one-time gift via PayPal. Now, this week marks the 9th anniversary of when I started this podcast, way back in July of 2017. I know I say this every year, but your interest in this podcast has really far exceeded any expectations I ever had for it. We have about 2.3 million downloads over the last year, which is a 23% increase over the prior year. Sadly, donations via Patreon have fallen by about 20% since last year. Part of my decision-making process on whether to continue this podcast is whether I get enough financial support to remain viable. Since I gave up my job to pursue this full-time, I have to consider whether falling donations mean that I have to move on to something else. If you can afford to support this podcast, either through an ongoing donation on Patreon or a one-time donation via PayPal or Venmo, I really do appreciate it, and it will factor into how long I continue to make this podcast. Each year, I also debate how far to continue the podcast, irrespective of money. I think the early federal era is key to the process begun by the Revolution, so I've been continuing with that. I am interested in hearing from all of you about where you think this podcast should end. We're getting close to the death of Washington, for example. I could also take it all the way through the War of 1812, which would mean the podcast would last for a few more years. Some folks have also suggested that maybe I should stop progressing through events and move to short biographies of people who were involved in the Revolutionary War instead of continuing on with these events after the war. If you have any thoughts on any of this, please let me know what you think. I'm very interested in your opinions. Today, though, we talked about the Yazoo land scandal, which was a massive nationwide fight that divided the country. Federalists focused on the importance of binding contracts, while Democratic Republicans focused on the fact that rich people were breaking the law to enrich themselves, and the Federalists wanted to let them get away with it. Of course, no one could sue Georgia directly, thanks to the newly passed 11th Amendment, but the court cases inevitably began when people began making land claims related to titles held under the Yazoo land sale. In 1799, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts became the first court to declare the sale valid and that the rescinding act was unconstitutional. In the case of Derby v. Blake, 2 New England speculators who were suing over a promissory note took the matter to court. The defendant argued that he shouldn't have to pay since the rescinding act nullified the deal. The court in that case held that the rescinding act was itself void and that he had to pay. In 1801, the Democratic Republicans swept into federal office. President Jefferson appointed Secretary of State James Madison, Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin, and Attorney General Levi Lincoln to a federal commission to decide how to resolve the land disputes that came out of this Yazoo land sale. Before the commission reached a decision, in April of 1802, Georgia ceded its western territory to the United States for $1.25 million. The land became federal territory, and Georgia was out of the fight. After nearly 2 years, the commission reported that the Yazoo titles were not legitimate because of the corruption related to the original sale. This, they argued, would be the case even without Georgia's rescinding act, since an owner who obtained land through illegal means could not be recognized as the legitimate owner of that land under the law. That said, the commission argued that it would at least be expedient to reach some compromise that would avoid decades of litigation and bring some finality to the matter so the western lands could be settled. The commission recommended reserving 5 million acres, or a fund of $5 million raised through sales of these lands, to be used to satisfy claimants who had invested in these lands based on the Yazoo land sale. Congress agreed and set aside 5 million acres as a potential compensation fund. For years, Congress struggled to come to a consensus. New England politicians wanted to offer compensation since they had many constituents who had invested in these deals. Other members of Congress objected to this and wanted the whole deal voided. They argued that if you invest in a corrupt land deal, you deserve to take your losses. In 1805, the House passed a compensation bill, but the Senate did not. In 1806, the Senate passed a deal, but the House rejected it. In 1807, Congress authorized the use of military force to remove settlers on these lands who claimed ownership under the Yazoo titles. Two New England speculators filed a lawsuit to force the U.S. Supreme Court to resolve this matter. Robert Fletcher of New Hampshire sued John Peck from Connecticut for a refund of the $3,000 that he paid for Yazoo lands on the argument that Peck did not own the land that he was selling because title had been voided by the Rescinding Act. The whole lawsuit was simply set up by men who were both part of the New England Mississippi Land Company and who wanted to get the Supreme Court to resolve this matter. The Supreme Court ruled on Fletcher v. Peck in 1814. Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion for the court, declaring that the Rescinding Act was in fact unconstitutional and therefore null and void. The majority decision used the same arguments put forth by Hamilton nearly 2 decades earlier. This was the first U.S. Supreme Court opinion to strike down a state law as unconstitutional. Speculators used this decision to assert their land claims and demanded the federal government register their ownership of the land. They also threatened to sue landowners who had purchased land from the federal government, which the initial speculators still claimed as their own. This finally spurred the federal government to take action. President Madison signed into law the Yazoo Indemnity Act of 1814. This law set up a compensation fund of $5 million to pay for claimants who had claimed to hold title to federal land. This fund was also necessary to resolve other disputes and make these claims final before Mississippi would be admitted as a state in 1817. Even this settlement didn't completely end the matter. The New England Mississippi Land Company spent decades more fighting for additional indemnification from Congress. It wasn't until 1864, near the end of the Civil War, that the Federal Court of Claims finally dismissed the last of these claims. None of the men who had paid bribes or who had accepted them were ever prosecuted for their crimes. Senator James Jackson, the reformer, would go on to serve a term as governor of Georgia. In 1801, he succeeded Senator James Gunn in the Senate. Gunn had completed the term that he had begun just before the whole scandal broke, and there was no chance of him being reelected. The Cherokee and Creek Indians, who continued to assert their own ownership of all this land, were eventually forced to march to Oklahoma on what became known as the Trail of Tears. My book recommendation this week is The Great Yazoo Land Sale, The Case of Fletcher v. Peck by Charles Hobson. This book focuses on the topic that we covered this week, and it really looks into the litigation that followed all the way to the Supreme Court. The author, Hobson, used to work for the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at the College of William and Mary. It was there that he had also edited the papers of John Marshall, who wrote the opinion in Fletcher v. Peck. His book on the Yazoo lands deal is a little over 200 pages, not counting notes and index, and was first published in 2015. My online recommendation is the original Supreme Court opinion in Fletcher v. Peck. I've added a direct link to the oyez.org website, which of course has all Supreme Court opinions. My question this week asks, would the American War of Independence have been avoided if taxes had only been levied on American colonies after they had been provided with representation in the British Parliament and it was voted on in Parliament? I'm really surprised that Britain never went this route. They could have just given each colony a single representative in Parliament. The group would have been far too small to have any real influence in Parliament, but it would have really undercut the rallying cry of taxation without representation. In truth, colonists did not want that. They wanted to be subjected to taxes by their colonial legislatures, but a compromise of giving them a representation in Parliament probably would have so undercut the Patriot movement that it would have faded, at least for a generation, until the colonies began demanding greater representation based on their population. The truth of any monarchical government, however, is that the leader needs to know when to share power and when to crush the efforts of others who are seeking to obtain power. In this case, the British government simply misjudged the power of the colonies and went with military suppression instead of small doses of political compromise. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.